So I want to introduce Don. I reached out to, like many of you probably have seen Don's photos on Facebook if you're on the Snoqualmie websites or anything, and just amazing photography. And I said, we need to have this guy come in and talk to Rotary. And I didn't know anything about Don. And then I contacted him, and this was before the beginning of the year, and with a lot of things happening with snow and stuff, we kept having to reschedule. But when I was looking at his biography, you learn so much. You're like, oh my gosh, this guy's really involved in this community, and so obviously he has a love for photography, which is apparent in his work. But he says that photography as a work of art connects with the heart of the viewer. I like to think of my photography as a soul, and that's why I normally watermark my photos with TGBTG, and that's to God be the glory. And obviously he is capturing the beauty of this valley, the God's beauty, and it's not so surprised that Don is an ordained minister as well. And he is involved in the Northwest Ministry Network in the Seattle area that serves 350 churches and 1,400 ministries over Washington and northern Idaho. He is also an author, Growing Discipline Organically, The Jesus Method of Spiritual Formation. So you're quite the artist. You got photography, writing, family man, married to Jody Detrick for over 40 years. 3 children and 3 grandchildren. Jody has written a book as well, The Jesus-Hearted Woman. I believe that was a national Seattle national bestseller. And his other hobbies include restoring, collecting antiques, bonsai, reading, writing, and riding a Yamaha TW200 hills. Is that an enduro or?
Yeah, it's like an enduro.
Okay, but an everyman. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your talents and your speaking with us today.
Well, thank you, Jonas, and thank you for the invitation, and to you and Kelly. It's always a joy for me to come and share with civic groups. I was a Rotarian for myself for more than a decade. When I was living in Chehalis, I was the pastor of Bethel Church on the freeway down there on Interstate 5, the large building at exit 72, if you've ever been by there, for about a decade. And I was a member of the Chehalis Rotary, so it's always fun to come and connect. I brought each of you a gift. These are, for those of you that aren't familiar with these are called postcards. And these are what our ancient ancestors used to communicate before email and text messages. So you're welcome to use those.
Now, is there somebody who actually picks these up from your house? Up like a post person or something? How do you?
You just put a stamp on it and stick it in the mailbox. Yeah.
They're called the mail.
That's how they work. Yeah. Yeah. And these are also available at the North Bend Visitor Center. But this morning, I want to share a little bit about a couple of my passions. One of them being photography, and the other, what I've kind of learned from photography over the years that's been very informative to me and helpful to me, both as a minister and in one of my other roles. I'm an adjunct professor at Northwest University in Kirkland, and also at our denomination seminary in Missouri. So I teach graduate classes and also doctoral classes on relational leadership and emotional intelligence. I got my doctorate, I did my dissertation, doctorate in leadership, and did my dissertation on preventing self-sabotage. So these are some of my learnings, and this is what I know, that blind spots occur in all of our lives. We all have them. John Maxwell said that it's an area in a person's life in which they continually do not see themselves or their situation realistically. And usually when we start thinking about blind spots, we probably think of a friend or an acquaintance or a relative that has a blind spot, because we're pretty quick to spot the blind spots in other people, but it's kind of difficult for us to see our own blind spots for a number of reasons. And I love, the Rotary motto, service above self, and the four-way test, because as you all quoted this morning, it really is a great blind spot checker if we put it into practice. It's a little bit like the golden rule, doing unto others as we would have them to do unto us. So the main thing, the main point of this little talk is the observation that we don't know what we don't know. And so we often make assumptions based upon what we think we know from casual observations or past experience. And when we do that, experiential blindness or confirmation bias occurs when we jump to wrong conclusions, and we are sometimes blindsided by our own blind spots. I don't know how many times that you have driven down Highway 202 and at 10 o'clock on a dark and stormy night. I have, over the last 15 years that I've lived here, I live in North Bend, numerous times. And only a few times have I encountered an elk at that particular moment. But that could give me a false sense of security, because my experience has been that even though I know elk are active at that time of night, they're usually not on Highway 202. But it's the one time that I just throw caution to the wind and go driving along in the fog without being observant and really paying attention to my circumstances, that I'm liable to get blindsided by an elk. And that's not a happy experience. I have friends that have had that happen to them. And it occurs in a lot of other ways. I grew up on a farm in Oregon, and so my tendency would have been, living in a rural area in the Willamette Valley, that city people are people that don't care much about country people, perhaps that they are snooty, or they have their own, they're set in their own ways, and they wouldn't understand rural or country people. And city people might have the same perspective of country people. And because I grew up in Oregon, that was illustrated by whether you were a Duck fan or a Beaver fan, because OSU is an Aggie school, and I was the president of the Future Farmers of America, a group in my high school, so I was one of those people. But I also learned a lot of leadership from that. So here's what I know. I know that we often miss seeing the beauty in life because we aren't looking for it. And so I remember this is a photo that is very familiar to a lot of people. Have seen this picture or one like it. I've taken hundreds of them over the past decade or so, of Bourse Lake, also known as the Mill Pond. The first time I saw a photo like this with a reflection of Mount Si, I said to my friend Danny Raphael, who lived across the street from me at the time in North Bend, and Danny was a photographer, is a photographer. I said, Danny, where did you take that? And Danny said, at Bourse Lake. And I said, is that around here? I mean, where's that at? I've never, and he said, well, it's the mill pond. I said, you mean the mill pond, like the old Weyerhaeuser mill site, Mill Pond Road? Yep, that's it. I've driven by it there 100 times, and I've never seen that. And he said, well, you got to be there at the right time. And since then, Danny and I have taken hundreds of photos of that, and now it's a destination spot for photographers, probably because Danny helped people on Facebook see that and realize the beauty there. But we often just pass right by things that could give us or others a great deal of insight just because we're not aware of when we don't take the time to pause. While this is a peaceful scene, this is a stormy scene, another familiar one to us at Snoqualmie Falls. I don't know how many of you have seen this photo before. I purchased it from the local historical society, but in 1890, now think of it, this is before the power plant was built in the side of the mountain there next to Snoqualmie Falls. This was 15 years almost before the invention of the airplane. And this guy, Charlie Anderson, who was in his late 20s, a Seattle resident, he was known for his stunts. And he would go up in a hot air balloon over Lake Washington with his parachute and jump out. And people would pay him to do that. And it was a way for him to make some extra money. So on this particular day in 1890, he took the train from Seattle that went directly to Snoqualmie Falls, and they had rigged up some cables up above where the railroad tracks are for him to go out on the cables and pull a lever and drop down and open his parachute. And so there were 2 train loads of people that had gone there to witness this event. And there was a photographer present. And shortly after he snapped this particular photo, a gust of wind blew Charlie into the falls, and he was dashed on the rocks below. You see, you don't know what you don't know. And Charlie didn't know that Snoqualmie Falls creates its own weather, right? Most of us know that. And it can be fatal for us at times. And so how can we overcome our blind spots? Photography is all about light and shadows and capturing it. I like to talk about the golden hour, which is right around now, right around sunrise or sunset on any particular given day. And today would be a great day for the golden hour. In fact, we often have our board meetings. We have about 40 people on our Northwest Ministry Network board here in this at the club. And on mornings like this, when you've got a group of 40 or 50 people that are supposed to be focused on board work, you've got a view like this and a golf course before them, it's really hard to keep them focused, right? And because of the beauty. But it's all about shadows and light. So this is a little underexposed photo of the North Fork right underneath the bridge. And that is the same photo that is correctly exposed. And you can see it's all about the light. And there often are things lurking in the shadow that if you would shine the light upon them would be very revealing in one way or another and bring us insight and beauty. This has become known by many people as the most beautiful driveway in America. Danny and I started taking photos of Rockwood Farm back a decade or more ago, and we feel badly that we did, and posting them because now it's been a tourist destination for photographers, and people do not respect other people's property and literally mess up the poor owners front of their property every year. But again, this is a little underexposed photo, and that's the photo with a little more light and perspective. And the perspective is what we choose to focus on. And obviously in a group like this, you wouldn't be a member of Rotary if you weren't a person that is interested in focusing on the positive components of life rather than the negative. So we try to focus on that, but the frame that we put around any particular environment or any particular setting that we find ourselves in really reflects our own style and point of view. In order to take this photo from Meadowbrook Farm, just up the road here on Highway 202, one December early morning where it was quite cold, I had to lay down on that grass in order to get that perspective. But I'm glad I did because it gives a different point of view. This is the same location, but a different time of year, obviously, with the elk out there. This is the same location, but another perspective, another point in time. And imagine hitting that bull going 50 or 60 miles an hour. You wouldn't want to do that, right? And there's another point of view, almost like they're hidden in the summertime there in the weeds and tall grass at Meadowbrook Farm. How many of you have seen this particular image before? Any of you? Any idea of what that represents? How many of you just think it's an ink blot?
It's like the snow on my driveway.
Yeah.
Golf course.
Yeah, I think we could all tell stories about that. Well, this is actually what that is. And so when when you have the context for it, all of a sudden you immediately can identify this photo. And the challenge to all of us with our own personal blind spots is discovering how we can see kind of beyond the surface and what our initial response is. They tell us that neurologists that we have about 3 seconds before we come to a judgment about something, and sometimes open our mouth and reveal our bias or what we are thinking. They say if we would only pause for about 3 seconds and stop and think a little more deeply, we might not say a lot of the things that we say or react the ways that we do, or in various environments and settings. I'll show you another photo. This is on the Oregon coast at Seaside. My wife and I were spending Valentine's Day there a couple of years ago. I love to get up early in the morning, so there was a big storm that night. And the next morning, and I said to Jody before we went to sleep that night, I said, you want to get up really early in the morning? You want me to wake you up so we can go walk on the beach? I'll take photos and you can do some beach combing. Of course, she told me I was crazy, and I was welcome to do that on my own, because she likes to sleep in situations like that. We all have our own perspective. And so I got up early in the morning and wanted to head straight out to the beach because, having lived on the Oregon coast for about 13 years, I know that after a big storm, you can find stuff. And so, wandering out there, when I got to about this point, there was a man approaching me who had just been to the beach. And he said, you must be a photographer. And I said, yes, sir, I am. I had my big Canon camera and lens. And he said, I think you might want to go and walk in the other direction. And that's all he said, and he walked on. And I had a decision to make at that point. I'm a man on a mission. I want to get to the beach. That's why I got up early. And but I paused for a moment and I thought, this guy might know what he's talking about. I'm going to take his advice. So I took the other pathway and headed out here. And I took these photos on that morning and headed up in that direction, not knowing what I was going to see. But this is what I saw. And nicely camouflaged in the seagrass was a herd of elk. And they were just starting to get up, and they may have just been bedded down for the night, but I didn't do anything to disturb them. But as I watched from a distance, I have a long zoom lens, I noticed that they started to get up. And after a while, they just walked directly to the beach. And I took this photo that appeared in the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation Bugle magazine a couple of years ago. Now, I would have missed that had I not listened to the man that approached me and said, you gotta go the other way. So at those kinds of intersections of life, we have to ask ourselves the questions, am I going to just go my own path and what I think I should do, or am I going to consult with others and listen to other people's opinions? So this is one thing that I have tried to put into practice in my life, and that is to be more observant. And I use the acronym to see. And I believe that I'm placed on this planet to serve others, service above self, and to encourage others and to empower others, particularly the older I get, younger generations, millennials, Generation Z, students, people that I can pour into, and I find a great deal of joy in that, serving, encouraging, empowering others. And I've learned that our emotional intelligence, or EQ, is dependent upon our ability to understand and relate to others. Our failure to do so reveals a common blind spot, and this results in what is known as the fundamental attribution error, which in psychology means that we often assume that the intentions or motives of others are really mean-spirited or negative, but we would never think that way about our own intentions and motives, because we usually feel like we have good intentions and motives, regardless of the expression on our face. Do you know what those two things are? I think they look like eyeballs.
Tree knots.
They are tree knots of the aspen tree. And an aspen tree, when a limb is cut or a branch is cut along the trunk, it creates this that I think looks a lot like an eye. So the problem is that we're on the wrong side of our eyeballs. And you know, how do we remedy that? My wife often tells me that, so since I came up or heard that phrase, and I use it quite a bit, she'll say, you know, let me tell you what we see from the other side of your eyeballs, you know, because you're not seeing the whole picture. That we all have blind spots. We're blindsided when we think we know what we don't really know. We're blindsided when we make false assumptions about others. And we're blindsided when we ignore or dismiss the clues from others. I'll tell you another couple of brief stories and then I'll be done. But when I was in high school, growing up on a farm, I started to drive when I was about 5 years old, a tractor. And that wasn't unusual. That was part of what you did. So by the time I was ready to get my driver's license, I knew how to drive. I knew how to drive tractors, trucks, pickups, standard transmissions, dump trucks, you name it, I could drive it. And because I had the mechanics of driving down. And so I felt pretty proud of myself about that. I could back a dual axle trailer and all of that. So in the small town I grew up in, on the month of your 16th birthday, everybody went to the local police station where the driver's examiner would come once a month to give the driver's test. So on that particular month, I showed up at the local police station, got an excuse from school, and there were a half dozen of my peers who all had birthdays around the same time. And they were scared to death. They were literally frightened of the driver's examiner and the test, because this was the driving test. And I thought I had that down pretty good. I was going to get in my dad's Oldsmobile 98 four-door and drive that. I could parallel park. I could do all of it, because in my mind, you have to know how to parallel park. You know, have to know how to, you know, get back to the station with the examiner still alive without having an accident, and you'll pass. And so, as it worked out, I happened to be the last person that got the exam. And every one of my peers, when they came back, they had a big look of relief on their face. They passed. And I was happy for them. And so it came my turn, and they all waited for me. I got out, I executed what I thought was a flawless driving test, did everything the examiner told me to do, parked the car in front of the police station, and looked at the examiner, and with a kind of a smirky, smart aleck smile on my face. And but he wasn't smiling. And I said, well, how did I do? He said, well, you didn't pass. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't joking. He said, you know, when you change lanes back there, you didn't check your blind spot. And he said, that's a fatal error. And I said, blind spot? See, I had a blind spot because I thought I knew how to drive. I hadn't taken the driver's training in-car part of the training that was offered in my high school. And I learned a big lesson when I walked back into that waiting room, and there were all my peers to cheer me on. And I had to humble myself and say, well, I didn't pass. And they were all very kind and gave me a pat on the back, said, next time you will. Well, believe me, since that day, I've never failed to check my blind spot. And we all have that. So how do we overcome our blind spots? We give to others the gift of presence. Being present, being really there, and listening attentively and actively to them. Being open to other points of view, trying to focus on mutual agreement, and seeking understanding, asking clarifying questions. If there's anything that I've learned as a leadership coach, it's the power of asking the right clarifying question to help someone move from where they're at to where they want to be, and to help understand more fully. So, this is my last story and I'll be done. But I have pursued bonsai as a hobby most of my adult life. I've always loved growing things and living in various parts of the Northwest. About 1980, I started the hobby of bonsai. I bought a copy of the Sunset book of bonsai and I read it, and I soon realized that I needed a mentor. And so I sought out a mentor. These are a couple of my trees that are in my backyard in my home in North Bend. And that's one of my bonsai benches, which was covered with about 3 feet of snow. Still, it remains to be seen how they have all turned out after that. But I ran across this fellow. I was living in Oregon at the time, Newburgh, my hometown, and in Portland I found Masa. And Masa became my Mr. Miyagi, if you've ever seen The Karate Kid. He taught me bonsai. The problem is, I didn't speak a word of Japanese, and he didn't speak hardly any English. But we communicated by observing him and watching him. And so he taught me. And he is from Japan. He was a master bonsai artist, won many awards. And so that's another photo of him that was taken in 1980 when he became my sensei, my master, if you will. And I always wanted to ask him more questions about his life in Japan, and even about some of the scars on his face and the fact that he had a glass eye and other features about him physically. But I felt at the time, I was young, and again, I didn't understand all of his culture, didn't speak his language. I just focused on the bonsai. And rather than seeking an interpreter, trying to find more about him. A few years ago, I was looking to see if I could reconnect with Masa, and I ran across his obituary in the Oregonian. And he had died on November 22nd, 2012. But I learned this, that he was born January 22nd, 1944 in Nagasaki. So he would have been a little over a year old when the bomb was dropped. And I started to tear up because I thought if I'd only known that, he could have taught me probably so many more things beyond the bonsai. So how can we be more aware? Because we don't know what we don't know, right? And I like to think that sometimes when we pause, that's why I love to take reflection pictures. This is of the Middle Fork. that when we pause and reflect for a few moments, we gain insight that we wouldn't otherwise. So that's what I want to leave you with this morning, and thanks for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about some of my passions. Thank you.